Remember Mercy's first major rework?
Yet.
Hey,
Oh, there you go. Hey! And he's back again. There you go. Okay, and then you're back again, boy.
Thank you.
Remember release Brig? Yeah, you could outswing a Rein with Rally. To be fair though, Overwatch is a tough game to balance with so many variables to consider like skill floor, skill ceiling, and hero interactions. There have been heroes that have been grossly overtuned, and it got me thinking when every individual hero's prime peak broken state was. So with inspiration from SVB, we'll go through every hero and show their current iteration at the time of recording this video and compare it to that hero's strongest state in Overwatch 1 history. D.Va's strongest state was in the patches between November 15, 2017 until January 24, 2018, which was Season 7 and Season 8 of Competitive. In 2022 currently, D.Va has a 300-300 HP split, but back then she had 100 less armor with a 400 white health and 200 armor split, a bit worse than today. She was also slower while firing with her fusion cannons at a 50% movement speed penalty compared to only being 40% slower today. However, she was deadlier in other aspects. Booster currently deals 10 damage, but she dealt 25 damage back in her prime state on a slightly longer cooldown. Defense Matrix was a big one that defined her, as she had a 15-meter range on it instead of 10 meters, which was 50% longer than what you're used to today. Her micro missiles dealt 9 damage per missile instead of 7, and Splash had a higher minimum and maximum with damage ranging from 2 to 6 instead of 1 to 4. This allowed her micro missiles to deal up to 162 total damage instead of 126 today. Her self-destruct also only costed 1,375 points, translating to roughly 11% faster bombs, and Call Mech costed 300 points at the time. Pretty similar, but both were quicker to build. Call Mech only did do 50 damage at the time, but let's be real, getting those remech kills today are kinda cheesy and situational. Overall, the reason why I consider this as the strongest state of D.Va was because of that larger defense matrix, which was so obnoxious to play against, along with the net plus 15 damage on the booster and plus 36 on micro missiles. This adds up to a total of 51 more damage potential in her overall burst combo, which crushed a ton of breakpoints, allowing her to instantly delete any 200 HP target with no issue. It was ridiculous because this was before Brig and before Baptiste. Orisa was strongest in the patches between June 25th, 2019 to August 13th, 2019, just before Sigma got released and Roadhog came into place, right around Season 17. This was when she first received her quality of life change to place her shield down while reloading, and she had 400 HP at the time, 200 health, 200 armor, which is a little less durable than today's 200 health and 250 armor split. But what made her so good? First thing we need to look at was her halt, which was ridiculous at this time, a 7.5 meter radius compared to 5 meters today. These were the days of pull plus anything as a combo. Pull dynamite, pull hook, pull nade, whatever. There was no escaping that radius. The snare duration was also a bit longer at 1 second instead of 0.65 seconds. The cooldown was a bit longer at 8 seconds compared to 6, but the value you would get while it was up was unrivaled. Plus you could do some fun flinging tech before they changed how halt interacted with certain abilities. Regarding her shield, what did it look like? It was 900 HP instead of today's 600. And it was on an 8-second cooldown instead of 10. Fortify had a 50% damage reduction instead of today's 40%. However, you were still able to be headshotted, but it didn't matter so much because you'd use it more to be immune to the CC because it was so much harder to break through the stronger and more frequent shield. The uptime was just too good. For Supercharger, nothing was changed in particular except that it costed 1,500 points to build, so it would be roughly 10% quicker than today. After consulting a few Rein mains, the majority believed his strongest state was the patch on December 10th, 2020, when his base armor increased from 200 to 250, giving him 550 total HP, along with his hammer damage increasing from 75 to 85. This state lasted until April 22nd, 2021, when they reverted his 50 armor, because he was performing a little too well, so he was back down to 500 HP total. Although Rein can one-shot people now with the recent shatter change, the extra 50 armor back then went a long way for overall survivability. Plus, he could still B-hop shatter back then. Ignoring the meta, this one's tough, so let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments for Rein. For Roadhog, he's arguably at his strongest right now. He was most popular back in August of 2020 with the Hog Zarya meta that even Overwatch League teams used, but since then, his patch changes have only been net positive, making this the best state by raw numbers despite current pick rate or popularity. You can see on August 13, 2020, they reduced his gun ammo from 6 to 5, but increased his projectile damage with a slower fire rate to turn him into a burst damage killing machine. A subsequent nerf happened to his projectile damage from 7 to 6 on September 10th, but this was to compensate the natural buff shotgun patterns received when they removed the random rotation, so this was a neutral change. Hook was buffed on September 26th to bring targets closer for better one-shot potential, and projectile damage buffed 10% from 6 up to 6.6. Then on August 5th, 2021, the biggest and best change of all that justifies current Hog as the best he ever was this unofficial passive that many people don't even know about. It's enemies generating 25% less ultimate charge from dealing damage to Roadhog, removing the biggest weakness in being a big ultimate battery. Sigma was definitely strongest on release on August 13th, 2019, up until his first of many nerfs beginning on September 17th, 2019. Get ready for the list here. Hyperspheres used to do 60 damage for a direct with a max splash damage of 35, a 5 damage increase per sphere. His shield actually began at 1500 back then instead of its current 700, more than double. Along with a shield regen rate of 175 per second, again, more than double the current 80 regen per second. He could also instantly deploy and retract his shield with no cooldown. The only downside to his overtuned release was probably his kinetic grasp, which was a little worse, but not by much. It only converted 40% of the damage to shields compared to today's 60, and was on a slightly longer cooldown at 13 seconds instead of 12. But it did have some OP interactions, as I like to call it, because you were immune to Hog's hook and Briggs whip shot, which has since been changed. Accretion used to do 80 damage for a direct rock hit, with a splash damage range of 15 to 50. The biggest one, though, that you need to look at is that knockdown duration, which back then had a range of 0.5 to 3 seconds. This knockdown duration scaled based on how far the rock traveled. So up close, yeah, maybe it's a shorter 0.5 second stun, but 3 seconds? Come on, are you kidding me? Now, if you add up the double hypersphere damage of 60 for each, that's 120, and then an 80 damage accretion meant that you could effectively burst 200 HP heroes with these breakpoints. Gravitic Flux was a little more expensive back then at 2170 points, but the initial cast time duration was quicker at 0.4 seconds, and the slow the enemy received after the slam lasted 0.9 seconds instead of the 0.6 seconds today. But honestly, the most OP part of Sig's ultimate was that once you selected an enemy into that lifting portion, it was uncancelable by any CC like stuns or sleep dart. It was always guaranteed damage. Looking back now, you can see his kit was way too overloaded considering how good he is even today in his current state. Fun fact, Winston is one of the few heroes who has received the least amount of balance changes over the years and is surprisingly in his strongest state right now, ever since his last buff on February 2021, where he received an extra 50 armor to shift his 500 HP split from 100-400 to 150 and 350. For the most part, he has only received buffs throughout the years, with nerfs being global changes across all heroes like ult charge cost, armor interactions. Not much else to say here, just take a look at his profile stats here, ape into enemies, and return to Monkey. When we talk about the strongest version of Ball, it has to be in the patches between August 13, 2019 and February 12, 2020, when they buffed Minefield projectile speed. A lot of people think it was a nerf, but in reality, the mines hit the ground faster, meaning they activate sooner. Ball was just overshadowed by Orisa, Sigma, and their states back then, but in reality, when we look at the numbers, he was in his prime during that period. To start, his quad cannons had a 2.5 damage minimum, since this was before the general hit scam fall-off nerfs. Now when we move on to his grappling claw, this was why he was at his best, because he did not have the respawn cooldown, nor the 6-second attachment time limit. He was also able to double, triple, and even quad boop before Blizzard removed double booping under the guise of a bug fix, which made a lot of Ball mains angry. The knockback was also 25% further than what it is today. Adaptive Shield had a small 0.3 second cast time, but it gave him much more shield at 100 additional per enemy within its 8 meter range that lasted for 7 seconds. A little bit shorter, but a lot beefier. Pile Driver was a little bit better too, rendering enemies unable to have air movement control for 1 second instead of 0.5 seconds, making it super easy to follow up. Minefield for the most part has been the same, but it used to clump on walls, making it debatably better or worse depending on the scenario. When thinking of her strongest state, I firmly believe Zarya's best was on the release of the game in May of 2016 up until November 2016 when her charge gain was reduced by 10 for both herself and ally bubbles. Before that though, 50 charge per bubble translated to a much higher average energy, and it was bugged for a long time where Zarya was getting twice the energy. Remember getting 50 energy off one Rein Fire Strike or one Genji swing? Pepper Ridge Farm remembers. Primary fire damage ranged from 95 minimum to 190 at max charge instead of the 75 to 170 today. That's almost an 11% DPS increase back then. Secondary fire damage numbers are similar, but the width of the primary fire beam and splash radius of the secondary fire used to scale with higher energy levels before they gave it a flat rate in the middle. Zarya really was a feast or famine character back then. Grav only costed 1,500 points to build up at the time, which is 40% less than today's 2,100 points after all the global alt charge nerfs. Not to mention it was 25% bigger at 8 meter radius instead of a 6 meter radius today. You put this version of Zarya in the hands of experienced players today and you'd see non-stop grabs with the faster alt rate and higher average energy, for sure. May 19th, 2020 marked the last buff Ashe received that smoothed out her ADS clunkiness before a bunch of subsequent nerfs came around on June 30th, 2020. This was also before the general hit scan nerfs, so her minimum damage while unscoped was 20, maxing out at 40, while her secondary fire minimum was at 42.5 with the max damage of 85. Yes, it used to be 85 instead of 75, which was absurd when accounting for damage boost or discord orbs, turning headshots from 170 damage to 221 damage, easy one taps. For comparison, today's Mercy damage boost at Ashe's 75 damage only brings the 150 headshot to 195, just shy of the 200 HP breakpoint. She also had 15 ammo instead of 12 when combined with her dynamite. She was a 200 HP assassin, as it used to deal 30 to 75 on explosion instead of 20 to 50 with the 100 burn, making the damage boosted dynamite one-shot 200 HP heroes by itself. Add to the fact that this was on a shorter cooldown at 10 seconds instead of 12 seconds, and you can see why she had to be tuned down to the 2022 version numbers you see on the left. Bastion's strongest state was a fun one. Let's rewind to February 27th, 2017, the unkillable OP Bastion patch that lasted only one day. One day before it was immediately hotfixed and reverted on PC, but console players were stuck on this version of Bastion for 2 weeks because Blizzard also had to go through Sony and Microsoft to deploy any patches. This version of Bastion was defined by the Ironclad passive having a 35% damage reduction, which was nearly double the 20% that we have today. Self-repair was at 75 HP per second, up to 4 seconds, a little bit weaker than today's 90 HP, but you were able to use it a little bit longer. His weapons were a bit weaker than 2022's version. It's similar damage, but the spread was worse and he only had 25 ammo on recon. Sentry mode damage is the same as today's, but the spread was always maxed out. His ultimate also only costed 2075 points at that time. Seems a bit odd to consider this version of Bastion the best when looking at all the buffs everywhere else, except Ironclad, but the problem was the amount of stuff Bastion could just straight up tank with this breakpoint, compounded with the self-repair ability. He could tank Reaper ults, pulse bombs, you name it. As we take a look at Cassidy, his best state was just a few patches before what you see here in January of 2022. It began on October 29th, 2020, in which he got a buff for an extra 25 HP that made him stronger in a lot of new matchups due to damage breakpoints. He was now able to survive 3 Hanzo Storm arrows or 3 shots from Ana as a few examples. His primary and secondary fire minimum damage at distance was much more potent at 35 damage at max range compared to 21, and 25 compared to 15 respectively. This made him much better against heroes that play a safe distance like Echo, which is one of the reasons why Echo is popular now due to Cassidy being much weaker with that damage fall off. His reload was much quicker back then too, at 1.2 seconds instead of 1.5, and his combat roll was 20% further at 7.2 meters instead of 6 meters, allowing him to escape enemy abilities at a better rate. You could also argue that in 2016, the whole fan the hammer meta or the no damage falloff patch right after was the strongest state of Cassidy. However, all the changes to his Deadeye, combat role, and other parts of his kit since then made that 8-month period between October 2020 till July 2021 his prime state in my opinion. To no surprise, this was also his most popular state in terms of pick rate amongst the larger pool of DPS options to choose from when compared to 2016. Doomfist by raw numbers and fluidity was probably in his best state between June 26, 2018 till December 11, 2018, about a 6-month period. For starters, his passive granted him 35 temp shields instead of 30, which compounds to extra durability when cycling a bunch of his abilities. His Rocket Punch windup only took 1 second to get max charge, which doesn't seem like a big difference when compared to his current 1.4 seconds, but you can definitely feel it as it's over 30% slower than what it used to be. His uppercut damage was the same as today, although on a slightly longer cooldown at 7 seconds, but enemies used to be movement locked in the air for 3 seconds compared to its current 0.6 seconds. That was ridiculous. Seismic Slam used to deal 49 to 125 damage, so it was reliably stronger, and it had a much further range at 20 meters instead of 15 meters. Meteor Strike was also cheaper to build at 1500 points, and his outer ring damage scaling was from 15 to 300. Meaning you could still reliably one-shot 200 HP heroes even if they weren't in the center. Looking back, Doomfist during this state was a nightmare to play against, especially since I'm a support main. It's a little biased, but remember this was during the pre-Baptiste, pre-Brig era. Echo is the last hero added for Overwatch 1 and was her strongest on release date on April 15th, 2020 for about a month until her first nerf on May 19th, 2020. Her passive, sticky bombs, and flight haven't really been touched aside from that super glide flight tech that actually never made it live, but adjustments have been made to her other abilities. Back then, her tri-shot had 15 ammo instead of 12, and focusing beam was a big problem because it used to be a 20 meter range instead of 16, and it used to last 2.5 seconds compared to today's 2 seconds. Duplicate also costed 1960 points back then and used to revert Echo back to full health, so it was super annoying to almost kill her, only to have her duplicate, go to full HP in her duped form, and then have her transform back at the end at full HP. At least now it only puts her at 100 health if she originally duplicated under 100 health. Still, Echo is in a strong state right now in 2022 since hit scans are nerfed across the board. Genji was decent a year and a half ago when his shuriken fire rate got buffed, but nothing compares to the original build on release from May 2016 till September 2016. These were the days where you could jump and reset that double jump by climbing a wall to jump again, giving Genji insane aerial mobility. Shuriken only dealt 28 damage instead of 29, with less ammo at 24 instead of 30. His secondary fire spread was also a little bit wider at 12 instead of 9. Tough to make sense of this number, but just try to imagine them fanning out 25% further apart than what you're used to now. The flex numbers are the same, but it actually used to have a bigger hitbox back then, which made it considerably better. Swift Strike has also remained similar as well numbers-wise, but Genji was able to use this ledge boost tech that was available where you dashed into a ledge and jumped, propelling you high into the sky. Dragon Blade was also much better back then too, as it only costed 1200 points. And lasted 8 seconds instead of 6, which is huge because that's 2 extra swings. So the hyper mobility of resetting double jumps, ledge boost, and super fast and more potent blades made Genji a monster in the early days. The strongest era of Hanzo was the moment Scatter Arrow was removed and replaced with Storm Arrow along with a lunge on May 3rd, 2018. His regular bow had similar damage, but the projectile is actually faster today in 2022 at 110 meters per second instead of 100 meters, making it slightly harder to land shots back then. However, Lunge on release also only had a 4-second cooldown instead of 5 seconds, and Storm Arrows, like I highlighted earlier, was released on an 8-second cooldown, did 80 damage per shot instead of 70, and had 6 ammo instead of 5. That translates to roughly a 20% higher uptime and usage of Storm Arrows, and the DPS potential was 480 damage instead of 350 damage today. Overall, it's actually quite crazy to think of the damage potential Storm Arrow had back then with damage modifiers like Discord or Damage Boost. An 80 damage Storm Arrow being spammed with a Mercy Pocket bumped it up to 104 damage per arrow, allowing Hanzo to effectively 2-shot most heroes or even 1-shot headshot them. This was a brand new patch, and it definitely wasn't stress tested by players yet, so it forced an immediate nerf 3 weeks later in the following patch. The Junkrat patch on May 19, 2020 gave him some much needed quality of life changes that put him in his prime. This patch adjusted his direct hit damage to 130 instead of 120, along with better velocity on the nade's bounces. However, they reverted the 130 back to 120 3 months later in August, removing the niche of having the highest single bullet damage amongst all Overwatch 1 heroes. Comparatively speaking though, there isn't much difference from today's 2022 Junkrat to this 2020 Junkrat, except for that. And the removal of the drop tire tech, which happened on May of 2021. It was quite annoying to die to it on the receiving end, but having that tool in Junkrat's arsenal allowed him to take aggressive, unpredictable angles against fast targets. May was best shortly after Roadhog came into place, between September 17, 2019 to January 16, 2020, where she was actually played in double shield quite a bit. Back then, her endothermic blaster immediately slowed a target by 30% compared to 20% today. Additional ticks slowed targets by 2.5%, whereas today it slows at 2.85% at a higher ramp-up pace. A target would be frozen for 1.5 seconds instead of today's 1.3 seconds, making it much easier to land double icicle headshots during her prime state. Her secondary fire actually costs less today at 10 ammo per shot compared to 20 back in 2019. However, her total ammo used to be at 200 instead of today's 120. The shared ammo pool with the lower cost encourages today's May players to use secondary fire more often rather than to be a freeze bot. Cryo freeze is actually better today as you heal around 51 HP per second instead of the old 37.5. Wall was used much more frequently in her prime as it was only on a 10-second cooldown instead of 12, and Blizzard lasted 0.75 seconds longer, which means it dealt more damage. Currently, Pharah is probably in her best state right now and has been since March 11, 2021 with her last buff to her hover jet regen rate from 35 to 43. She's just overshadowed by a lot of other heroes. That's it, nothing else to say here. This video is supposed to be outlining the hero's prime state, so look at her profile on the screen and go watch Yazin, aka YZNSA, and see what the best Pharah in the game is capable of. Reaper is arguably in his best state right now, ever since the last buff on June 3rd, 2021, where his lifesteal got bumped up from 30 to 35%. Some people may argue that his best state was when he had his 40% lifesteal back in the double shield meta late 2019, but I would argue that the change on February 18th, 2021, where they reduced his shotgun spread and reduced the pellet damage made him a much more versatile fighter. Here's a graph by workshopper Lotto OW, where orange was before the change and blue was with the change. This basically meant that he would deal less damage up close, but the tighter spread meant his DPS at mid to long range was higher and more consistent. So yeah, go play Reaper right now, he's pretty good. Soldier was strongest beginning on October 13th, 2020, because this was when his bullet spread was completely removed and replaced with vertical recoil, which was easily controllable and with 30 ammo. The damage was 1 less at 19, but his minimum damage was much higher at 9.5 compared to 6, and therefore he was more consistent at longer ranges, being able to poke and pressure enemies. This prime soldier state lasted until July 1st, 2021, when all hit scans had their fall-off damage scale at 30% of its max, meaning today's soldier's minimum bullet damage is 6, because 30% of 20 is 6. Biotic field is also a little worse today at 35 instead of 40 HP per second back then. Sombra had the highest pick rate in ranked across her entire history between June 18th, 2019 till August 13th, 2019, mostly due to quality of life changes like cleansing anti-nade from Ana's nade upon teleporting and cancelling Hog's hook animation. Her primary fire weapon actually has a 10% less spread right now, but other aspects of peak Sombra 2019 were superior. First, hack lasted 6 seconds instead of 5, and translocator cooldown was 4 seconds instead of 6. Her bonus movement speed in stealth was a bit slower at 50% instead of 65%, but her EMP was solid. It used to only cost 1250 points instead of 1400, and the cast time activation was much quicker at 0.2 seconds instead of 0.35 seconds today. The biggest difference in Sombra's prime state versus now is definitely that EMP cast delay. It may just be a 0.15 second difference, but it is very noticeable if you played a lot of Sombra before and after that change. The strongest Symmetra state was between August 13th, 2019 till September 17th, 2019. right after the last teleporter buff, roll lock, and double shield becoming meta. Sim's damage was ridiculous at full charge, and they had to nerf the beam width and the damage numbers 1 month in on September 17th. Looking at her overall peak profile, we can see her HP was actually at 200 instead of today's 225. As we move down, her primary fire beam used to scale at 65, 130, and 195 for level 1, 2, 3 respectively, which was +5, +10, and +15 more than today's. The beam width was at 0.3 instead of 0.2. It's kind of hard to visualize, but imagine it being 33% bigger. Her sentry turrets used to deal 50 damage per second instead of 40, which was huge. That's 20% more damage than now, and multiply that by 3 turrets and you've got some really hefty DPS. Her teleporter cooldown was a bit longer when destroyed at 12 seconds instead of 10, but this wasn't as significant because once it was up indefinitely. Her ultimate used to have 5000 HP instead of 4000, and it lasted 3 seconds longer at 15 seconds. Although the numbers clearly imply it's weaker today, it's still a pretty good ultimate because dealing 4000 damage is quite a lot, and frankly the teamfight is probably over after a few seconds once this wall goes up. So overall, looking at her profile, the biggest takeaway here was that her primary fire and her sentry damage was way too strong at that time. Torb is honestly really strong right now. As recent as his January 2022 patch, where his alternate fire ammo costs 2 instead of 3 now. He's just really hard to play reliably due to the projectile nature of his primary fire, which is bad in a lot of matchups. Like his overload is good, his secondary fire has only received buffs over the last few balance changes. Not much else to say here. Gone are the good old days of scrap gathering and armor pack Torb.
Come get your armor!
Tracer is one of the least changed heroes in the history of Overwatch, with mostly nerfs across time due to players just getting better and better at one of the highest skill ceiling heroes in the game. Her strongest state was release on May 24th, 2016 up until about November 15th, 2016, before any of the pulse bomb nerfs and any of the hit scan stuff. Her pulse pistol's min-max damage has been the same, with adjustments to her fall off over the years. It used to start scaling her damage down at 10 meters with the full fall off at 20 meters. That's actually weaker than today's Tracer, where she can deal her full 6 damage per bullet until enemies are further than 12 meters away. Pulse Bomb used to only cost 900 points, about 40% faster than today's 1260 points. It also used to deal 400 damage instead of 350, allowing her to crush some breakpoints like one-shotting a Zarya, or if you were nanoed, dealing 600 damage with the pulse on tanks. Widowmaker was another hero that was best on release in May 2016 for a few weeks. She had 200 HP back then, she only has 175 HP today, so it was a buff back then. But the biggest reason why she was good was because her base damage on her weapon was 15 up until it was nerfed to 12, which is what you see today. When you multiply that with the scoped scaling charge, that meant she was able to do 150 damage body shots, making playing Tracer against her a nightmare since Tracer could just die. 150 damage body shots when accounting for boosts for damage breakpoints would make her ridiculously OP, and fun fact, at this time, Zen actually had a 50% debuff on his Discord orb, which translates to Widow dealing 225 damage with body shots at this time to discorded targets. That's ridiculous. There was no fall off at this time, and she only had 30 ammo instead of today's 35, but only consumed 3 ammo per shot instead of 5. If you were a Widow 76 connoisseur, you would have been happy with that flat 13 damage on her SMG, because today they actually applied the regular 30% max damage nerf with the fall off range, but nobody really cares. Grapple did have changes throughout the years, but it's actually currently back at the cooldown it once began at, 12 seconds. And finally, Infrasight is 40% more expensive today at 1540 points. Ana on release was meh, but it was after her first round of buffs shortly after that put her in the strongest state between July 26, 2016 up until October 11th that year. Peak Prime Ana was defined by a few traits. First, having 80 damage per shot meant damage breakpoints with Zen Discord or Mercy damage boost bumped it up to 104 damage per hit, allowing her to 2-shot 200 HP enemies. Healing was a bit better too, at 75 a pop instead of 70. However, her ammo was lower at 10 shots and did not have the benefit of passing through full HP teammates. Sleep Dart used to keep targets napping for 6 seconds instead of 5, and Bionade was super good because after the flat 100 healing, every subsequent shot for 5 seconds would be plus 100% healing, which means double the healing amount for that duration. The area effect was a little bit smaller at 3 meters though, and it could not pass through full ally HPs at the time. Now, Nano Boost was the big defining trait of Prime Ana as well, as it only costed 1300 points compared to today's 2100, which was effectively 60% faster to build, relatively speaking. Its damage buff and reduction has remained the same, but the unique identifier was that it used to have a 30% speed boost built into it compared to today's instant 250 HP you gain. Both have its use cases, but the faster time to build the ult with the built-in speed boost definitely had better ultimate synergy, making Reaper's Beyblade or Genji's Nano Blade incredibly difficult to counter at the time. Baptiste's strongest state was actually a few months after release, right after the June 18th, 2019 patch to August 13th, 2019, where he actually got buffed with extra healing ammo and a longer window, as this was just before people realized how OP Immortality Field was. Anyways, let's begin at his biotic launcher. The 3-round burst used to deal 12.5 damage at minimum, up to 25 per bullet, compared to the higher falloff today at 7.2 to a max of 24. While the raw bullet damage was higher, his fire rate is important to consider, as 1 burst per 0.65 seconds back then was actually much slower than today's 0.58 seconds. It's a 70 millisecond difference, but it actually changed his optimal DPS combo to heal, shoot, versus shoot, shoot, heal, if that makes any sense. He healed 60 HP per grenade no matter what back then, while today, a direct hit is rewarded with 70 HP, while splash is only at 50 HP. In translation, that meant old Bap just had to mindlessly shoot the ground, while today, you sorta have to aim directly at a target for higher heals. Ammo back then was higher at 12 instead of 10, so you didn't have to reload as often. Regen burst was on a longer cooldown at 15 seconds instead of 13, but it was stronger as all allies received 30 HP per second for 5 seconds, so 150 HP for everyone. Today, it's only 150 for himself, and only half of that at 75 HP for his nearby allies. Immortality Field is where things get spicy. Good God, look at this ability. Look at these numbers at a glance here. 20-second cooldown, 250 HP, lasted 3 seconds longer, and it kept teammates at 20% HP minimum. Yup, lamp. Amp Matrix was also a big factor in his prime state. Despite it being much smaller at 5x4 compared to today's ultra-wide 9x5, the cost to build it was only 1750 points compared to 2310 today. That's over 30% faster. Building a quick tempo window in like 10 to 15 seconds was a big part of his game back then. If you thought Baptiste was overtuned on launch, get a load of Brig on release from May 20th, 2018 till numerous nerfs began starting 2 months later in May. Brig's 2022 numbers are going to be again on the left, and everything on the right indicated by green is what was stronger 4 years ago in her peak state, while something in red is not as strong. To start, her HP used to be 200 health, 50 armor for 250 total. Super tanky, as today she's only at 200 HP with a 150 health, 50 armor split. Starting with her passive Inspire, it used to heal about 16 HP per second for 5 seconds, translating to about 80 HP. Today it heals 15 HP per second, but lasts 1 second longer, which translates to 90 HP over time. A little bit more, but spread across a longer duration. Her passive numbers might actually be better today. As we proceed though, this won't be the case. Rocket Flail has been stable over the years, but look at her shield. It used to be 600 HP, with it regenerating at 100 HP per second instead of 85. If you somehow managed to break her 600 HP shield back then, it would actually begin recharging after 3 seconds only compared to 5 seconds today. Regarding her bash, it used to deal 50 damage compared to 5, had a 90-degree cone compared to 60, which basically means it was 50% wider and easier to connect, and it stunned enemies for 1 whole second instead of 0.5 seconds. And it was all on a 5-second cooldown. And it went through all barriers.
Bruh.
Whipshot was a little worse back then, having its projectile speed more than half of what it is today, so it was super slow to get out. But this was Blizzard's way of compensating Brig after they tuned everything else in her kit down. Don't be fooled though, she was still a monster as we get into Repair Pack, which healed 150 HP with up to 75 overhealing as armor. The armor portion was seriously much better than today's 110 health over 2 seconds, but you only had 1 use on a 6-second cooldown, as opposed to today's 3 charges at 6 seconds per charge. Different strengths and weaknesses here at play, hard to say which one is objectively stronger. However, when we get to Rally, there was some serious oversight on being able to release it at this state. It used to only cost 2,250 points compared to 2,800, so it was much quicker to build as a first point. It gave 15 armor per 0.5 seconds, so up to 150 armor on herself and allies. It lasted indefinitely, allowing some players to overlap rallies, keeping permanent armor on. And back then, armor sorted itself underneath natural shields, so it was very hard to remove as you had to damage all the shields to get there first. On top of that, it was also severely bugged, where damage reduction was recalculated on every layer of armor. In short, every armor layer added during Rally was effectively making it 20 to 45% stronger than intended. Some people may say the release of this hero changed the game forever, and I don't blame them. Release Lucio with the giant aura was one of the most popular, but that was probably because there weren't that many healer choices back then, and Lucio has received a ton of quality of life changes that made him better over the years. His best state was probably after the August 9th, 2018 patch, up until around March 19th, 2019, an 8-month stretch. His individual wall ride speed buff was only at 20% compared to 30%, but he was a much stronger team player. His default crossfade healed at the same rate, but the speed buff was 5% higher by default. When amping it up, the team's move speed was up at 70% compared to today's 60%. Sound barrier has remained the same numbers-wise, except that it built quicker at 2625 points instead of today's 2940 points, which, fun fact, is the highest amount of points required to build an ultimate across all heroes. Lucio isn't necessarily bad today when compared to his prime state, but he's very comp dependent on speed and overshadowed by other supports at this time. There seems to be a trend where support heroes had the most polarizing peak broken states, and Mercy was one of them. Season 6 of competitive Overwatch on September 19, 2017 was the patch where Blizzard addressed the mass res problem and reworked the res into a regular ability and gave her a new ultimate called Valkyrie. At this time, Mercy had a near 100% pick rate when it hit because it really was that overtuned. Beginning with her staff, it healed 60 HP per second instead of today's 55. Damage boost remained the same, but Resurrect was quite a bit different and is a very powerful ability. Res used to be instantaneous, as opposed to the slow 1.75 second channel time today, along with that slower movement speed that she experiences during the animation, and it's all on a 30-second cooldown. But the interaction of Res with her ultimate Valkyrie is what made her terrifyingly overpowered. Whenever Mercy ulted, the res cooldown would instantly reset, allowing you to use 2 reses in quick succession. However, res's cooldown would also change from that 30 seconds to 10 seconds while in Valkyrie, and Valkyrie lasted 20 seconds back then instead of 15. So in theory, you could res, pop Valk, res again in 10 seconds, and res one more time just as Valk runs out. So you could effectively res 4 times just north of 30 seconds. And when compounded with the cheaper Valk cost at 1625 points, the higher chain healing since it was 60 HP per second, and her super fast movement and HP regen, you were basically a fast resing, unkillable moth, as many called it, and defined a few Overwatch ranked and Overwatch League seasons. Moira's strongest state was between March 19th, 2019 until a few nerfs began to hit later in October that year. She was essential in Goat's comp and double shield variations when Roadhog came out due to the piercing nature of her orbs and ult. If we take a look at her numbers, it's quite telling why Moira has fallen as the lowest pick support in Grandmaster and above. Healing numbers look abysmal compared to what it used to be. 80 HP per second with 65 HP over 4 seconds lingering, way more than today's numbers. Her resource consumption was 11 per second out of the 100 in the meter, meaning it would take about 9 seconds to deplete if you're constantly peeing on someone, as opposed to today where it drains 12.5 per second, which takes about 8 seconds to deplete. In short, it's less healing up time if you held the button down today. However, she does regenerate it quicker today at a passive rate of 3.84 per second, as opposed to the old 2.4 energy per second. And it actually recharges at a faster rate if you use the secondary fire at roughly 16% of her resource meter per second compared to 12.5%. Self-heal on the secondary fire was a bit more potent at 30 HP per second self-heal as opposed to 24 per second, and the ability hitbox was actually 37% bigger, meaning there was more forgiveness if your aim tracking was just shit. Biotic Orb is split between 2. Damage Orb dealt the same, but Healing Orb used to heal a bit quicker at 75 HP per second instead of 65. The orb traveled a bit slower in her prime, but damage orb was more reliable because it used to have a bit of a bigger range at 5 meters instead of 4 and lasted 10 seconds instead of 7, giving you more opportunities to get random bounce kills late in its flight. Cooldown was a bit longer back then at 10 seconds instead of 8, but I do feel the nerf to the duration of orb helped mitigate the random kills you'd get by just sheer luck of the orb lasting so damn long. Fade is actually better today as of the recent buff, where you're able to do a super jump at the end to get into more favorable positions. Then finally we have Coalescence, which costed so much less at 2125 points compared to 2800 today. That 2800 cost today is one of the reasons why she isn't played that much, because it takes way too long to build Coalescence, and enemies who run Baptiste get Amp Matrix first and out-tempo you in most scenarios. OG Zenyatta was quite the hero. Some of the more recent players never knew the sheer power of his July 19th, 2016 Season 1 state, where he finally went from 150 to 200 HP. You may see his orbs here doing much less damage back then at 40 per orb, and orb volley had a longer 1 second cooldown recovery between shots, had weapon spread, yada yada yada. But take a look at his Discord orb. You see this number? 50% damage received. The projectile speed was also faster at 120 meters per second compared to 90 today, meaning it would get on and off targets 25% quicker, just a bit snappier. This by itself would be so broken in the context of player skill and target focus today. Discord Orb has been heavily regarded as a strong ability by high-ranked players for so long. Even at its long-standing 30% debuff, it actually had to be tuned down to 25% in recent patches, and it's still good. Finally, Transcendence only costed 1650 points instead of 2310, a whole 40% quicker to build, rounding out this version of Zen as his prime 5.5 years ago. Whew, that was a long video, a great nostalgia trip of Overwatch 1 as we inch closer and closer to Overwatch 2. Thanks for hanging in there. My socials are on screen with my stream on the left at twitch.tv/KarQ.